You can have competition between the armed forces. There's no reason why you couldn't allow, for example, the Air Force to compete with the Army for land operations, for land tasks. There's no reason why you've got to have tanks. You could have helicopters rather than tanks. And these helicopters and tanks could be privately provided.
Hello. On the 23rd of June, the forces of the private military company Wagner launched a rebellion against the Russian government. This lasted barely 24 hours, but during this time, they shot down 7 military aircraft, killing 13 pilots, captured the city of Rostov-on-Don without a shot being fired, and advanced to within 120 miles of Moscow before being called back to their bases by the company's founder, Yevgeny Prigozhin. Though Prigozhin is now in exile and Wagner faces being broken up, these dramatic events have sparked renewed interest in the use of private military companies, not just in Russia, but around the world. To discuss this, I'm delighted to be joined by Keith Hartley, Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of York and the former director of the university's Centre for Defence Economics. So, my first question is, what is a private military company?
It involves private companies offering military services, where the military services range from fairly innocuous. They're a bit like policing operations operated by private companies, where the innocuous ones are patrolling, personal protection, protecting key assets such as pipelines, gold mines, protecting people, protecting convoys of land transports, protecting merchant ships. So the protection end of the operation is fairly simple, straightforward, where you're really applying and using military force to achieve objectives which are fairly simple to define. So you can write a contract for them. And that's the problem with private military companies, writing contracts for ranging from very simple operations, which I've described, to extremely complex operations like frontline military combat operations, where you don't know the end outcome. You don't even know who you're going to be fighting. And that's why it becomes very difficult to write comprehensive contracts for what are extremely complex operations.
So you mentioned one of the key ways that private military companies have been used in the modern world is largely in a defensive sense, protecting bases, protecting convoys, protecting VIPs. Wagner in Russia seems to have been used in a rather different and rather more expansive way. Why do you think that is, and has this led to problems?
The reason it is that the Russians wanted military assets. They wanted personnel and a military fighting force to fight in Ukraine. And Wagner was readily available and could perform that task, like any private company responding to a market requirement. The problems have emerged in that they can't be controlled. And I think the recent mutiny showed the unreliability of private military companies. But having said that, it doesn't follow that state-owned and state-provided military forces are totally reliable. They have been known to mutiny.
Well, this is obviously private military companies of one sort or another, or mercenaries as they're more traditionally called.
Yes, that's right.
Is a very ancient profession, and going right the way back to Machiavelli made very similar critiques to you, that mercenaries are, in his view, both useless and dangerous. Throughout much of history, many great powers have had used mercenaries, but it seems to decline the use of them through the 18th and 19th century until it reaches a sort of low point in the 20th. What are the reasons for that, and why did countries stop relying on them so much?
Well, I mean, one simple answer is the First and Second World Wars. In the First World War, nations needed large concentrations of military personnel, and they recruited directly. They were the ones who hired, as a state, they hired military personnel, and they controlled them. And they basically had a military employment contract, which required the military to perform certain tasks, quite often these being unspecified, apart from do as you're told and obey the following orders. And effectively, the state could acquire large numbers of military personnel, which it needed to fight the First World War, and then, of course, to fight the Second World War. So the short answer is the state could acquire military personnel in large numbers and quickly and train them to their required standards. And it was difficult to find military mercenary groups of that sort of size and scale that could fight in those circumstances. And it is extremely difficult, if you think about it, to write a proper contract for combat operations. The examples I gave earlier are very simple, where you can write a contract, a fairly simple contract, such as for policing, for guarding, for training, for consultancy and advice. These are very simple. Do this and we'll pay you X. You guard this military establishment, you guard this person, and we'll pay you by results. When you come to fighting the First World War and the Second World War, you didn't know who the enemy was. You quite often find you start by fighting country A and end up being involved in fighting countries B, C, and D. The Korean War is a good example of that. You ended up with a fight between North and South Korea, and then suddenly we had China involved. And China was a massive resource commitment, requiring the sort of forces that private military companies didn't have available. And there are other problems with private military companies, which is their willingness to finance, to provide and risk costly assets. So if you buy a modern aircraft, the private company is going to be very reluctant to use that for fear they would lose it, and they lose a large part of their assets.
So it's, in your view, it's a product of the increasing cost of military assets that makes it more difficult for private companies to compete with states.
Yeah.
Why is it then that we seem to have seen something of a revival in the 21st century of the use of PMCs, private military companies?
Well, the main aspect is, I mean, what is surprising in terms of the Wagner initiative is that we knew little about Wagner, and it's surprising that Russia, as a major power, and particularly a state-controlled power, used a private military company to fight its wars and battles. But we've seen a revival of private military companies associated with the Iraq conflicts, the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, where particularly the Americans started using private companies to perform military tasks that in the past would have been performed by the United States Armed Forces, but in fact they were hived off, and the private military establishment provided a capability that became easily and quickly available when the Americans wanted them for a whole variety of contingencies in the Middle East. So it's not just the Russia and Wagner. We have seen a revival in the Iraq War, but certainly before that, during the First and Second World Wars, private military companies were not involved in fighting.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point about Iraq being a sort of key point in the development of the modern private military company. You mentioned that PMCs were taking on roles that previously would have been fulfilled by the US military, or the state.
Yeah.
Why did the US military make those decisions to outsource those sorts of services rather than doing it themselves? What were the advantages?
There are a couple of advantages. One is physical, in the sense that you can quickly acquire resources that might be otherwise difficult and costly and time consuming to obtain. But having said that, the whole issue of private military companies raises a general point, which I've got to mention. And we know so little about them. This is the problem with private military companies. And we didn't know, for example, about Wagner. That illustrates just how little we knew about private military companies, especially in a country like Russia, which should be the last you'd think of in terms of having private military companies. But we know so little about private military companies, quite often in some cases because of security concerns. They're involved in activities that might be regarded as illegal, in some cases are illegal.
Yeah.
They might be involved in assassination missions, almost like the mafia, where the mafia could be regarded as a private military company. They're not going to publicise their activities, so we know little about them. And there's a lot we need to know about them before we can do a decent analysis of them.
Yeah. Well, you say that as a problem, but it isn't it is a problem for academics that we don't know very much about them.
Yeah.
Can that not also be an advantage from the perspective of states?
Oh, yes, yeah. In principle, there's no reason why private companies can't provide military activities. Certainly if it's in terms of what you might call the relatively uncontroversial ones, like policing and guarding. It's the combat missions that become a problem. And also the other problem that arises is whether the private military companies observe legal conventions. You've got to remember that the military companies are involved in an activity which is killing. They're going to be killing people, and you're killing people. You've got problems about human rights, understandably, and the legality. And the point about wars and states involved in wars is that the states give legal approval for their citizens to kill other people. Whereas private military companies, they're involved in activities which, if you think of them in terms of policing operations, would be regarded as illegal. We don't want private people who are not officially approved killing others. We want them to be subject to justice constraints, to be subject to basically law and order, and not to be like the Wild West, effectively.
Yeah, it's interesting that in going back to the Russian example, because I think it is, and with Wagner, because I think it is so interesting, they seem to have been allocated specifically tasks that are as far as possible from this simple policing work. They were essentially instructed to take a fortified city of Bakhmut,
right.
and before that Soledar. Do you think the tensions that emerged between the Russian Ministry of Defense and Wagner were just an inevitable product of the mission that they'd been assigned?
Yes, it is. Inevitably, if you ask Wagner to do certain functions that traditionally would have been performed by the Russian Defense Ministry, you're setting up tensions. The conventional defense ministries, armed forces, armies, navies, and air forces are established groups. They don't want other people interfering in what they regard as their traditional monopoly property rights. So if it's an army job, then the Russian army sees it as its role to perform that job. It does not want a private company like Wagner interfering with its activities and with its role and with its mission.
So why do you think Putin did allow this? Why did he, help to create a large private military company of tens of thousands of men? Why not just leave it to the Russian army?
One simple answer is that Wagner became a private army for Putin. It was his bodyguard, extended bodyguard, and dictators like lots of bodyguards. They want to be protected. And so Wagner, in that sense, became Putin's private army. It was an army he could use for his preferences, for his wishes, and his desires. So if he wanted to do something, he doesn't want to have to go through negotiating with the Russian army. He can ask Wagner to do it directly.
Aha. So it's a sort of a case of horizontal competition that is often quite appealing to autocratic states, that you have different power bases.
Yes.
I suppose in some ways, is it similar to what happened in Sudan, where you have the Sudanese army, but also elements of the Janjaweed militia that then got incorporated by the state.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah.
We've seen the Sudan case is a good example of the chaos and confusion which actually emerges when you effectively have two branches of the armed forces engaged in a civil war.
Yeah. So, given that we've had recently two very clear cases of civil disorder, even civil war, resulting from non-state military organizations being essentially given too much power, given too much influence. What do you think the future is for PMCs? Will other countries be more cautious about using them in the future, or will their appeal continue to remain?
Well, I think their appeal will continue to remain for non-combat functions. For activities that don't involve combat, it's when you start real fighting, you get some problems. Nations, as private military companies, they have the option of walking away. Effectively, you needn't bother having a mutiny. They simply say, we're not going to fight that war. So nations quite often find themselves fighting wars of their own design. They want to choose, and they do choose, who are going to be their rivals, their enemies. You can't leave it to private companies to select who's going to be your enemy and who's going to be your friend. States themselves want to be in charge of that. But there's no reason why private military companies increasingly couldn't undertake support activities, defense support activities, like training. There's no reason why, for example, the military, in our case, the Royal Air Force, must train its own pilots. It can actually get private companies to do the training of pilots, as long as the end result is to produce a trained pilot. And it's just like driving and the driving test. There's no reason why private companies can't teach you and me to drive. And the key test is they don't want to own the training functions. The key test is to produce a trained driver, a trained pilot, a trained soldier. Those are the things that the armies and the navies and the air forces want. Those are the end outputs. And they're not bothered too much, and shouldn't be, about owning the assets that train these resources.
I think that's a really interesting point that takes us on to the broader question of outsourcing. In fact, as a kind of final question, I was wondering, are there any broader lessons that we can take from the experience of states with private military companies when it comes to, say, defense procurement?
Yeah, I think what private military companies would show will be the potential for introducing competition into the armed forces. There's no reason why you can't get private companies introducing competition into activities that traditionally have been monopolies. There's no reason why submarine protection of submarines, or other activities can't be performed by alternative sources, like private companies could provide a whole range of alternatives, such as air defence, training I've mentioned at some length. Then we've got protection of sea lanes. There's no reason why you couldn't have private companies providing protection of activities that in the past have traditionally been performed by the armed forces themselves. You could have competition between the armed forces. There's no reason why you couldn't allow, for example, the Air Force to compete with the Army for land operations, for land tasks. There's no reason why you've got to have tanks. You could have helicopters rather than tanks. And these helicopters and tanks could be privately provided.
What, so the Air Force would rent its helicopters from
Yes.
Raytheon or whatever?
What you have is a possibility of rent a tank, rent an aircraft carrier. In principle, you could actually hire out these activities to the armed forces rather than the armed forces owning them.
Well, on that fascinating note, I think we'll have to end it. Thank you so much for coming online and talking with us. I think it was really interesting. If you like what you saw, please hit the subscribe button, and you can learn more about the IEA's work by visiting our website at www.iea.org.uk. Professor Hartley, thank you once again.